for what they say about the end times or about the Messiah. And they've had biblical teachers who've told them that's what you ought to be looking for. And that's what those teachers tend to look for, and they tend to ignore a lot of the other stuff in the prophets. That's way too narrow a focus, and it misses most of why the prophets spoke. The key to reading prophecy well is, what did that message say or mean to the people hearing it at the time of the prophet? That is the lesson to emphasize. Those lessons are still important to us today. So when you read one of the prophets, try and be concerned with what that message meant to the people who were hearing it right in that day and age. That's the lesson that you ought to be learning, not focusing on something that was going to happen millennia later, which, well, I'll talk about that in a second. Second point, prophecy is generally conditional. That is, think of it in the form if, then. So most of the prophecies, there are exceptions to this, where God says, this is definite, this is going to happen, I can't change my mind. But generally, the prophecies come and they say, if you continue, this is what's going to happen. If you change, something different is going to happen. And so prophets are laying out messages saying, your choices make a difference. You can either go the path you're going, and this is what will happen then, or you can change your ways and something different will happen. Almost always something better. There is a tendency among readers of the prophets to think, well, it had to be that way. And it generally was that way because the people didn't change their ways. But God sent out a message through the prophets encouraging them to change. And things would have been different had that occurred. Okay, third point. Most Old Testament prophecy is to an entire nation or people, the Jewish people, the Israelites, especially Israel or Judah, nations with a special covenant with God, often in the form of if statements. And if you really want to get into this, look at Deuteronomy 28. Lays it out for the entire history of the Old Testament. If you obey, if you stay with God, if you're holy, if you don't have false gods, you've got blessings coming up. If you don't, and he spends most of the chapter laying out layer on layer of all of the bad things that are going to happen to the people of Israel if they don't follow God. So it's very conditional. The biblical scholars say it's laid out just like legal agreements of that time, contractual. God was making a contract with the people of Israel. You do this, you get this. You don't do this, there's consequences. So that's the way the Old Testament structure was laid out. However, it's fairly clear from the New Testament, although I'll be honest, theologians and people in different denominations, they argue about this a lot. Basically, the kinds of promises and challenges that are laid out for Israel in that day and age now belong to two different groups, not particularly to Israel, not particularly to nations, but they belong to the Christian church overall, and to some degree to individual congregations, and they belong to individual believers. That is the level at which this material, which was laid out for nations, two particular nations in the prophets, that material was laid out for nations, but instead it really belongs to the church and individuals now. The connection to nations, with the possible exception of Israel, and again, lots of theologians argue about this a lot, the connection to nations is very, very limited. So those are some background points that you need to really begin to take the different prophets and begin to apply their lives to your own time and your own life. All right. There's three levels why you ought to be, in that context, there's three levels why you ought to be interested in reading the prophets. One is, the first is that they can be really interesting. There are some amazingly quirky things that are reported in the prophets, and we'll touch on some of those later on. Some of them are flat out bawdy. Second, the prophets add a lot of detail to the history and social and spiritual situation for Judah and Israel, and it helps us to understand how God works with them and gives us a little context for how he can work with us. And then third, for studying the prophets, we can learn from how and why and how the prophets are, well, let me just read it. Why and how are the prophets important to me and you, and to how we walk with God? And that's going to be our primary emphasis today. Now, I don't like, as I noted, I don't like to be completely just generalized on this. So we're going to look at the book of Hosea for a focus of our own talk on the prophets more generally. And Hosea's got three parts. There is a life story in chapters 1 through 3. We don't think of people living prophecy through the way they living their life in a way that becomes a prophecy. There are a few groups, contemporary groups, you hear about every now and then. They don't seem to last very long, but they go out and they do street skits. And those street skits are supposed to represent the gospel and some of the messages of God. These life stories are one step beyond that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But chapters 1 through 3 of Hosea is the story of Hosea and Gomer. I'll probably do that again. When I was typing it out, I several times called him Homer, and only when I got to Homer and Gomer did I realize that I was getting it wrong. But chapters 4 through 13, the story that is laid out in chapters 1 through 3 is then illustrated. It's used as an illustration for God's complaints about the nation of Israel. It's primarily Israel, but sometimes they divert to Judah and they say Judah is a little behind, but they're coming along too. So there was an unfaithfulness in Israel, and that is detailed. And I mentioned the if-then structure of most prophecies. Chapters 4 through 13 is very much in the if then bad category. If you keep on doing what you're doing, bad things are going to result. And chapters 4 through 13 illustrate that. Chapter 14 is different. It's a relatively small chunk of this entire book, but if you keep on doing what you're doing, good things, if you change from what you're doing, good things can happen. And chapter 14 lays that out in a very short, simple form. Now, there are several real life stories where the prophets act out or they demonstrate their message from God. We don't think of prophets being that way. We think of them just either writing down or talking different things about God's message. But there are lots of spots where they sort of act it out or demonstrate it, and we'll look at some of those in just a moment. But we're going to start with Hosea, and we'll start with especially the story of Hosea and Gomer. And I'll be honest, I feel sorry for you if you haven't really looked at this story in any depth over the years, because it can really enrich your understanding of how God works with us. All right, chapter 1. God tells Hosea to marry Gomer. And God warns and lets Hosea know, as part of this marriage, that Gomer is either, and the language is not clear, but the warning is there, Gomer is either already a prostitute or she's going to become an adulterer and prostitute during their marriage. And God says, go ahead and marry this woman. Not what we think of as the kind of guidance that God gives us in terms of setting up a marriage. And Hosea does obey, marries Gomer. Their marriage goes on to produce 3 kids. The first kid gets a name that indicates that Israel is not faithful to God. God's got judgment coming. The second 2 kids are given names that imply that they may not be Hosea's kids. They may be children who were produced through adulterous relationships. One of them is not my people, is the longer way of explaining the name. So the question is, how will Hosea relate to that kid? And we'll see a little more about that as we go along. And at the end of the chapter, you've got this marriage there, but it's obviously got some structural problems. There's a couple of kids that their parentage is questionable, and that's the situation at the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. This is later. There's a break in time. Hosea's got all of the kids. He's relating well to the kids, and Hosea is encouraging the kids to intercede with their mother to stop what she's doing, to come back and reestablish the marriage and to be close. Now, if you read through the chapter, Gomer's having a good time in her context. She's got some lovers. They're rich. They're cool people. She's gone off with these cool people. She's gotten lots of nice gifts from them. And she's not interested in going back to this prophet of God and hanging around with the kids. She's having too good a time. So that's through and Gomer is sending the kids around trying to persuade her to come back. Well, that lasts for about half the chapter. And one of the messages that Hosea has been saying is, you got to realize the stuff you've got in these gifts, that's not most of what is keeping you going. It's stuff that I have provided in the past. That's what really is your foundation of support. Gomer ignores that. And then the lovers begin to disappear. And then her support begins to disappear. And Hosea continues to call her back, but at the end of the chapter, Gomer hasn't gone back, but she's broke, she's homeless, and she has only rags to wear. Okay, that's the end of the second chapter. The marriage is busted. Hosea has continued to try and call her back, and she hasn't responded. Chapter 3, again, a break in time. Chapter 3 is a very short chapter. Gomer is in a slave market. She's being sold as a slave. Hosea comes and offers to buy her back, says, you've got to come back, you've got to affirm the marriage, you've got to be faithful and true. And at the end of the chapter, apparently she has agreed to that, and he buys her and brings her back as his wife. So that's a life story. That's not what we think of as prophets at all. But certainly more interesting than, I'll be honest, the part of the Bible that I like the least is probably Leviticus. I have never been fond of learning the details of making the clothing or the ingredients for the oils. I knew an architect once, actually came to this church, who loved the details of the size of the ark and the size of the tabernacle. And I think he led the Sunday school class for a while, and they spent several weeks building a model of the tabernacle. Not my groove. But when I think of the Bible, there are parts that interest me more or less. Hosea and Gomer, I find a real interesting story that most people don't know about. Other parts I find less interesting, but God works on all of us. But most people have no idea that there's a story like Hosea and Gomer in the Bible. Now, the rest of Hosea turns to broader themes. We're still passing on God's message, but now we're doing it to Israel mostly and some to Judah. Broadly, and we'll do more on this in a little while, chapters 4 through 13 describe what Israel has done to ignore or throw away a relationship with Jehovah God, who wants to care for them and bless them. Instead, they have chased lovers. This is a bad if, leading to terrible consequences. Chapter 14, if Israel will turn back to good and be faithful to God, there will be blessings of peace in good conditions. So we're going to look at some of the negative stuff in chapters 4 through 13 a little bit, but I want to move briefly to some of the other good stuff in prophets generally. Why read the prophets? Here again, that basic theme. I noted that there were 3 ways that the prophecies are worth reading. First, they're interesting. And I've got a whole list of them here. If I was really short on time, I'd chop a bunch of these and just offer you this list, but let me just mention some of them. God has several people act out the punishment that is coming for sin. Ezekiel was especially good in this. Ezekiel, in chapters 4 and 5, he has 4 different stories. He builds some bricks. He draws diagrams of the city of Jerusalem on the bricks. He sits there and stares at it a while, and then he busts them up. And it's symbolizing that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. It's as if you built a Lego situation. You stare at it a while, you put on a sign saying, "This is Jerusalem." You smash it all up with a hammer, and then you put on a sign saying, "This is Jerusalem," if they don't change their ways. Second story, he's supposed to lay on his side for several months, then switch to his other side, literally lay on his side for several months. I assume he got to get up for the bathroom or something like that, but I think he was supposed to eat while he's lying down. Lays on his side for several months, switches to the other side for a shorter number of months, and the message comes down that the number of days you laid on the one side is supposed to symbolize how long you're going to be in exile, and the other side is how long it's going to be until the exile. I think that was the particular connection. But I don't think if CJ were to go out under the overhang out here and lay on one side for the next 6 months, and then turn over and lay on the other side for 2 months after that, people would probably try to get him committed. That's not how we think of prophecy working, but it certainly would have been a topic of interest, I think. And it might get people to think about the way they live. All right. The next one, Ezekiel. I come from a prison system. And the description of what Ezekiel was supposed to eat for a period of time sounds a lot like what the prison systems of the country call Nutriloaf, which is you take some grains, you take some vegetables, maybe you mix in a little meat or meat broth, you put it all in a pan, you bake it up, you got this one hunk of stuff, and that's your meal. And that was used in our prison system. We don't do it anymore. It proved not to be very effective in terms of calming people down. But it was used for people who were taking their food and smearing it and throwing it and all that kind of thing, and it reduced that kind of thing a little. But that's basically what God told Ezekiel to eat for an extended period of time. And he was supposed to cook it. Well, the final agreement was that he was supposed to take dried cow patties. I don't know how many of you are rural, but you get, when cows poop, they have round things, and they actually dry, and they actually do burn up. You can use them for fuel. There are cultures in the world that still do that. And that's what Ezekiel was supposed to cook this Nutriloaf over. And it was to symbolize how unclean and how desperate Israel's situation was. And then the fourth story was Ezekiel was supposed to shave all the hair of his head, or all of the hair of his body. And then he's supposed to throw a bunch of it away. He's supposed to burn most of the rest, and he takes a little bit of it and ties it in one of the corners of his garment. And that's to symbolize that most people are going to die when Jerusalem falls, or when the nations fall, and some of the rest are going to get scattered around the world, and there's only going to be a handful of them left to survive this ordeal. So those are some highlights from Ezekiel. They're all sort of in one little chunk. Isaiah 20 reports that as a way of conveying his message, Isaiah walked around 3 years with no clothes and no shoes. Again, not what we would think of as a typical prophet. It certainly must have gotten his message across. There were some colorful visions that the different prophets brought forward. One of the most interesting is in Amos, partly because it's an interesting contrast. Amos had one vision where locusts and then fire were going to destroy the land. And Amos turns to God and says, "Oh Lord, that's so terrible. Can you not put it off or forgive?" And God does. And I thought about bringing a genuine plumb line, but I didn't. But this ought to do about the same same thing. A plumb line is a heavy weight at the bottom of a rope or a cord. And if you drop it, gravity says it's going to be nice and straight. And God finally gave Amos a vision with a plumb line against a wall that was seriously bent, about to fall. And Amos agreed, yes, God, if you're really going to judge fairly, it's time to go ahead with your judgment, because this indicates that something is really out of kilter. Ezekiel has a couple of stories that are very similar to the story of Hosea and Gomer. Won't go into those details. And he also spends several years mostly living as a mime. Ezekiel was very hesitant about being a prophet. And God finally said, all right, you don't have to spend your days talking about me. As a matter of fact, you don't have to spend your days talking at all. You're not going to be able to talk except when I've got some specific message to pass on to the people of Israel. And then you can talk. When I'm finished with the message, you stop. And he spent several years being unable to speak, except when he had messages from God. So if he had extra stuff to say or extra explanation, he'd mime it out. He'd just make gestures and things like that. Jeremiah's got an interesting one. God tells him to take a loincloth. A loincloth is basically the way they wound a cloth around your private parts. And it is the equivalent of contemporary underwear. And God tells Jeremiah to take a loincloth and go off to a river and bury it next to that river. And then a couple of years later, he says, go find that loincloth. And Jeremiah finds it and pulls it up. It's all rotted away. And God says, go show it to people. This is what your nation is like. It's all kinds of dirty and rotten and corrupted. Is there any reason why I wouldn't throw you away? So those are just some of the kinds of things that wordy parts, and you don't notice these other things stuck in the middle, but they're worth noting. The second major reason for looking at the prophets is that they're informative and educational. Prophets have lots about the social, economic, political, and religious activities of the time. Some pieces of history are barely reported except in the prophets. There are parts of the prophets that inform us about the end times, about the Messiah, but many of those were not linked to the future until after Jesus. After Jesus, the early church, I think especially Paul, they went back and looked at the Old Testament and they found chunks that nobody had ever thought of applying to the end times or to the Messiah. And they say, see, they were talking about this way back then and nobody had noticed it. So there's informational and educational information, but we can overread how much some of the particular concerns we have with prophecy and what's that doing. All right. Third, reading and learning of these prophecies was important to them then, and it remains important to us now. Even if we don't know the historical context, it is clear that to continue doing evil results in a bad end. Still, if we turn to God, there can be forgiveness and blessing. Let's go back to Hosea chapter 4. Here the prophecies begin to focus in on the kinds of sins that were rampant in Israel. Okay, and these kinds of things are repeated as you get into chapters 5 and 6 and 7, but they've got a lot of them sort of condensed in chapter 4, so we're only going to look at that part. If you look in verse 3, there is swearing, lying, killing, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and murder follows murder. And it goes on down in verse 5. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. So, and going up, there is no faithfulness or kindness in verse 1, and no knowledge of God in the land. So it's become a very irreligious society, and one that does not particularly, it's beginning already to show the consequences of not following God. And then if you get on down in the chapter, priests and people and leaders are all condemned. And on down into, verse 13, there's lots of sacrifices to false gods, false idols, especially tree groves they use for their sacrifices. And these tend to be, most of the gods outside of Israel tend to be gods related to fertility. So you got involved with these gods if you wanted your crops to be good, if you wanted to have lots of kids. So lots of fertility oriented stuff. So they naturally, a green grove of trees, that sounds fertile and that kind of thing. So that's part of it. But as you get on down into 13 and 14, therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with harlots and sacrifice with cult prostitutes, and a people without understanding shall come to ruin. So lots of sexual misadventure in the whole thing, and it relates really to false worship in many ways. Verse 17 sort of summarizes it. The whole land is joined to idols. Okay. Now, the origins of this particular sermon go back a couple of months for me when I read Zechariah and then Hosea for my devotional time in fairly short interval. There were a couple of other books in between. But as I thought about it chapter by chapter in those books, and then in the other prophetic books, it all reduces down to a basic theme. We humans tend to drift from God and choose to associate with idols or false gods. And as I would go through the different chapters, the question, there's variations on this. I'm going to read some of the variations in just a minute. The questions I would ask are basically, have I got a false God? Is there something that I am making more important than God? And really, there's 14 chapters in Hosea, and I do about a chapter a day, and Zechariah, I think, has got 12 chapters. So having done this for about 3 weeks worth of time, the point begins to come across. A challenge to me, some of these kinds of questions. It doesn't take exactly the same form, but it's basically got its same root. Have I got a false God? Is there something I trust more than God to solve my problems? Is there something I value more than God? Do I think I can play around with something wrong, and as long as I sort of follow God, it will be okay? Do I think that I am so good that nothing wrong can happen? Do I think that my past record will get me through? And just in preparation for this, I went back and looked at some of the good kings of Judah. And there are several who are listed as good kings. And I picked 3 with really long reigns of 40, 40, and 52 years. Each of them got into trouble spiritually in the last few years of their life and paid for it. So you can't count on your record to keep you online. You got to be doing this every day to the end of your days. Going back up to the question, is there something I value more than God? Wish more of you got the newspaper, but I can understand why you don't. They're pretty expensive. The email probably doesn't give quite the same effect. I stole this one from this morning's paper. Sunday Huddle. Let me just read the commentary that somebody not preparing for our church writes as a comment to go along with this crying couple, probably shortly after the defeat. They are taught to hate Michigan because their lives lose worth if their team does not beat Michigan. Their parents, their teachers, and the Ohio State University teach them this. This is not life. This is a cult. Look up the word psychosis and tell yourself if it doesn't apply. When happiness depends on one thing, perfection from a college football team, then doom is destiny. I don't want to be somebody who just points out other people's temptation areas. Now, it's interesting that I pull that out of the paper because for most of my life, reading the paper has been one of my big temptations. And you may think, how can that be a threat to God? But I can tell you that for at least 20 years, the morning newspaper was the biggest way that I shortchanged my devotions. I'd bring in the paper, I'd open it up, I'd set it on the table, there'd be something I'd get hooked on, and all of a sudden I had maybe 5 minutes to do a devotion time. So even things that you think are legitimate can be something that you're putting ahead of God and following God. Let me just note some of the kinds of things that sometimes get ahead of our chasing God. Our reputation, a desire for pleasure, a desire for power, wealth, or success, our self-image, our health, money-making, entertainment, pleasure, sports, accomplishments. If I am in trouble, do I turn to God? Do I turn to friends? Do I turn to addictions? I've known people who have that kind of a situation. That's their relief from difficulty. Do I turn to government? These are all things that compete, that sometimes we will place in front of God in terms of dealing with our needs and dealing with our spiritual life. Now, this is not just an Old Testament theme. In Revelation 2, verses 4 and 5, the letter to the Ephesians, Jesus notes that the church at Ephesus is doing pretty good overall, but he faults them It says it's going to bring you down. You have lost your first love. Okay? Get it back or suffer. And it also goes back to Exodus, the first of the 10 commandments. And I had it memorized, and it likes to leave you at the right time. Exodus 20. Love the Lord your God, and I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. All right. Fortunately, after the story of Hosea and Gomer, after the detailed accounting of Israel's sins and the consequences in chapter 4 through 13, there is chapter 14. In verses 1 through 3 of chapter 14, if we turn from evil and talk to God, if we don't trust in earthly power, and we work to do good in God's eyes, then in verses 4 through 7, God will heal Israel's faithlessness and love them freely. Verse 8 is a plea again to Ephraim or Israel. And just to note, Ephraim is one of the tribes that comprised Israel, and during that part of time, they were the dominant tribe. It's not two different bunches of people. They just sometimes flip the names. In verse 8, in a plea to Ephraim and Israel, God will work with you. God can work with you if you stop loving idols and understand that and walk in God's ways. So I encourage you to read the prophets and see what they remind you about how to live. But then and now, commit to walking in God's ways. Let me finish the sermon with verses 23 and 24 from Psalm 139. I think most of you probably know it. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Amen. Now, as a benediction, CJ suggested 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. It's a good one. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Amen. Go out and serve God. Thank you.